right, let me just share my screen. Might take a moment. While I'm getting this shared, good morning, everybody. As Whitney said, my name is Rebecca Ozarian, and I am a livestock and natural resources advisor in Fresno and Madera counties. And as she said, today I'm going to give kind of an overview presentation on some of the most common weeds that we have in California grasslands and rangelands that will hopefully lay some groundwork and maybe drop some nuggets that will come up in some of the later speakers' presentations as well. So a few key topics I want to cover this morning. First is kind of describing our common grassland plant communities that you may be familiar with, depending on what area of the state you're calling in from. Then talking about some of the key weed identification tools that are available to you. Then I'll dive into some of the most common weeds and considerations for how best to manage them. And then I do have some additional resources at the end that I heavily rely on and I think you'll find useful as well. And I do want to comment that my slides will be made available to you afterwards. So there may be a few instances where I have quite a lot of text on a slide, so please don't worry about trying to read it all right now. You will be able to read it at your leisure afterward. So we'll dive right into California grasslands. Typically in California, we have annual grasslands and oak woodlands that are dominated by annual grasses and wildflowers. Most of the annual grasses in California are non-native. And some of the species that you may be familiar with include wild oats, medusa head, cheatgrass, and goatgrass. Now, many of these are considered weedy, medusa head, cheatgrass, and goatgrass especially. But wild oats is also not native, although it is technically a palatable grass that sometimes people will manage for. So that's one of the things that can be a really challenging thing in California grasslands, that we may have desirable species, but we also have these undesirable species that have similar life histories. Now, there are other kinds of California grasslands, including coastal prairie, which is a more perennial grassland system dominated by bunch grasses typically. Unfortunately, in these systems, a lot of the invasive species can actually be invasive perennial grasses as well, such as velvet grass and harding grass, and other perennial species, even woody species, can do really well on these grasslands. You'll see in this photo here near the coast that these perennial bunch grass grasslands also often have a really lush wildflower component. Now, I do want to lightly touch on some other common California rangelands that are not dominated by grasses. This includes chaparral or shrublands that are dominated typically by things like ceanothus, which you might call deer brush or buck brush or coyote brush, and then manzanita species. And these can typically be found in the foothills and even in the coastal range and Sierra Nevada ranges at higher elevations. And these are just some example species. There are many other shrubs that are common in California. Now, we also have deserts in California, which are considered rangelands typically because they often can be grazed or browsed by livestock or wildlife. We have hot deserts that can be dominated by species like Joshua tree, shown in that photo on the bottom there, or by creosote bush. And then we also have cold deserts, such as in the northeastern part of the state to the east of the Sierra Nevada, with juniper and sagebrush, among many others. And our deserts are also often invaded by invasive annual grasses. So I'm going to now shift us into the weed identification portion. I always hit on this when I talk about weeds because to me, weed identification is the most important and first step in weed management. If you don't know what you have, you don't know how to deal with it. And more importantly, weed identification or plant identification in general can help you determine if a plant is toxic or harmless, for instance, to grazing livestock. You can determine if it's palatable or non-palatable, again, to livestock or to people, if it's a native species or a non-native species. And in general, you can use any kind of criteria when identifying a plant to determine if it's something that you want in your ecosystem or if you don't want it there. And of course, this all leads back to being able to manage it. And so the images here, I wanted to share 3 photos of very similar appearing species. All 3 of them are thistles, but 2 of them are native, 1 of them is non-native, and 1 of them is almost exclusively found in vernal pools, which are a really unique system in California. And so you might have different strategies to manage for or against each of these thistles, but until you know which one you have, you wouldn't be able to do the right management strategies. So there are a lot of tools that are available for California weeds. And if you're calling in from somewhere else, a lot of these can be useful elsewhere as well. Number one, I do want to share and remind you all that cooperative extension, such as where I work and where most of the colleagues speaking today work, is a great resource. You can go to the Rangelands UC Davis website that's linked here. And again, this will be shared with you afterward. It's linked here, and you can click on the county in California where you are and find a local professional or a local contact who can help you identify almost any plant that you might encounter. Second, and my personal favorite, I have a copy right here, is the book Weed Control in Natural Areas in the Western United States. I highly recommend this book. A lot of my information later in this presentation comes directly from this book. It's a really great resource that goes through some of the key identification features of the plants and a really thorough discussion of all of the different control strategies that can be used on that species. We also have the websites for the Weed Research and Information Council. It has an interactive tool that's really helpful to go through and identify a plant based on the visible features if you have no idea what it is. And our UC IPM website also has a wealth of information. Now, lastly, these are some apps that are available that are not from the university, but that can be very helpful to identify plants if you just have a smartphone out in the field. iNaturalist and PlantNet can both be used as kind of a crowdsourcing method. They rely on a network of global members who have a passion for identifying plants, or in iNaturalist, also animals, insects, and so on. And PlantSnap is a neat one that if you have wildflowers or a weed that has large visible flowers, you can actually take a photo with PlantSnap, and it uses computer algorithms to try to identify the plant for you. The one limitation of PlantSnap is that it doesn't do well with plant that doesn't have visible showy flowers. So it's not as good for things like grasses or for any plant that just doesn't have flowers when you see it. Okay, I know I'm going really fast, but I do want to get to the meat of this, which is really talking about the weeds that are in these systems. So I have here a photo of some of the most common grass weeds in California. Now, from left to right, we have barb goatgrass and jointed goatgrass, which are closely related species. Then we have hair barley, which is also called foxtail. We have medusa head, we have ripgut brome, and we have soft chess. Now, soft chess is a little bit unique on this picture because although it is an exotic annual grass, so it was introduced to the United States, it's actually typically one of the most palatable grasses on our rangelands in California, and often land managers will manage for soft chess. So it's mostly included here as a comparison for what might be desired, even though it's also not a native species. Now, one really exciting thing about this photo to me is how it highlights the differences in the timing of the growth and life cycles of these species. You might notice that barb goatgrass, jointed goatgrass, and medusa head are all still green in this photo. And all of these grasses were clipped at the same exact time to take the photo. So in comparison to the hair barley, the ripgut brome, and the soft chess, barb goatgrass, jointed goatgrass, and medusa head are still alive, which means that if you had gone out maybe a few weeks earlier, the more desired or less harmful species of soft chess and hair barley and ripgut brome, which before it goes to seed can be palatable, they would already have produced seeds when you could still come in and target the goat grasses or the medusa head. And so timing is really critical to distinguish between different species when working with grasslands. So I want to share for each of the kinds of weeds I'm going to talk about today, some of the principles of ways that we can target these different plants, and also some of the challenges that we encounter when trying to manage them. So for grasses, there are some features that may make them easier to manage. For instance, they rely 100% on seed production. Now, keep in mind, I'm talking explicitly about annual grasses. Perennial grasses don't rely entirely on seed production. But for annual grasses, seed production is critical to their survival, which means that by reducing or preventing seed production, we have now a strategy to reduce their population. Next of the features is that they are small and delicate texture when considering all kinds of plants that are out there. So this might give us a lot more treatment options. Being small and delicate means they're more likely to be grazed. It means that they're more likely to burn easily. We can use mechanical treatments like mowing on a large area, depending on the terrain. And so this gives us a lot of options by just how they are physically built. But of course, there are a lot of challenges with any kind of weed in a grassland or rangeland system. The number one challenge with grasses, as I mentioned on the last slide, is that our undesirable grasses have a huge range of overlap with our desirable species. And so coming in and trying to remove something like Medusa head means really tricky balancing of the good grasses that you want to keep versus removing the Medusa head. Another challenge of grasses in these systems is they have long living seeds. So even if you have a very successful year of treatment, you may need to come back for several years to repeat that treatment to really knock out the population, because there will be seeds that survive in the soil. Another challenge with grasses is their seed heads. So a lot of the photos down here just show late in the season, many of our exotic annual grasses will grow awns on the seed heads that make them essentially unpalatable to any kind of livestock, because they don't want to put their faces in those spiky thatch that's created, and they don't want to deal with them poking in the gums. That can cause some real damage. So that can make it more challenging later in the season to really remove those seeds. And lastly, I also include that when thinking about management strategies, these grasses often avoid the negative impacts of fire by producing seed and then being dry when a fire comes through, so their seeds are fine and survive. And they also can be the key fuel source for a fire to come through these systems. So here I have a table that is one of my slides that has a lot of text. Don't worry about reading all of it now. Again, you'll have access to this later. Just summarizing some of the key messages about how to manage these crucial invasive species in our rangelands. So I've got Medusa head, barb goat grass, and foxtail and hair barley, and just go through the mechanical options, how or whether prescribed fire can work, how grazing can work, and how herbicide can work. And so the overall message I want you to see from this is that we do have a lot of options when controlling our grass species. The really key part here is just the timing of that strategy. Okay, now we're going to move on to the broadleaf or forbs, also called wildflowers, although most of our weeds, people don't typically tend to focus on how pretty they are. So I've got listed here yellow star thistle and other thistles, puncture vine, spurges, and perennial pepperweed. Now, I don't have yellow star thistle pictured, but I'm hoping most of you can recall what it looks like. I do have a photo of a different thistle, really just highlighting that the physical structure of these thistles can make it challenging to remove with grazing or by hand. You might need really thick gloves to deal with this. And they can also grow to be very large and dominate the space and exclude other desirable plants. Now, puncture vine is that second photo, and puncture vine is toxic to livestock. It also grows very flat on the soil surface, so it's hard to graze even if they wanted to. And it has those very spiky seed pods or goat heads that will hitch a ride on basically anything they can touch. And so it can be very rapidly invasive and very challenging to combat. Now, spurges I don't have a photo of, but they can also be toxic to livestock. They have a milky latex or milky sap when the leaves or stem are broken, and that is also toxic to livestock. It can cause skin irritation. And so typically grazing can be challenging with spurges, although sheep and goats have a decent tolerance for some of it in their diet. And so grazing is still an option sometimes. And then lastly, we've got perennial pepperweed, which is that last photo. And one of the key issues with perennial pepperweed is that it will actually draw salts up to the surface, making the soil surface less habitable for other species. And I think you'll hear a lot more about pepperweed later this morning. So I will move on now to the principles of forb management. So like with the grasses, I'm going to talk about the features and things to look for and the challenges of management. So the features with forbs is that thankfully, a lot of them have a really distinctive appearance. This can mean that it's easier to identify them. Now, sometimes it's not the case. Sometimes we have plants that look very similar that either evolved for similar systems or happen to be closely related and can be really difficult to distinguish between. On the plus side, though, if you have closely related species, they often will respond similarly to management. The second feature of forbs is they tend to have a larger leaf area than something like a grass. So this means that A, they can be even more enticing to livestock if they're not a toxic species. Livestock might choose to go for something with more leaf area. They get more nutrition from the leaves than they do of the stems. The other benefit of large leaf area is that it gives us something to apply chemicals to if we are going to use a chemical herbicide treatment. And the third feature of these forbs is the flower phenology, or the timing of that flowering is a really visible tool to help us perfect our timing of treatment applications. You'll notice on the left and on the right, there's these different stages of flowers in the thistles, and what we've got on the right here is fiddleneck that can be very visible to help you know when exactly you need to treat that plant. Of course, there are challenges, as with everything. A lot of forbs do have grazing deterrents. So as I've mentioned, there can be chemical deterrents like toxins, and there can be physical deterrents like the spines on that thistle, or even the small hairs on the fiddleneck on the right photo. A lot of forbs also have a dual reproductive strategy. So unlike our annual grasses, which rely 100% on seed production, many forbs produce seeds, but also have underground stems or roots that can reproduce by vegetative spread. These root and stem systems can also be really extensive. And so any treatment that we apply, if it doesn't remove the whole root system, in some cases, that means that the plant can resprout and might have a different shape that makes it more challenging to treat again. Now, lastly, with this, I do want to reiterate, as with grasses, forbs often have long-lived seeds in the seed bank. Yellow star thistle, for example, has been known to survive for at least 7 years in the soil. And so for something like yellow star thistle, you may need to be looking at a 7-year plan of how to continually reduce that population over time with repeated treatments. Okay, so I know this is a lot all at once. Again, don't fret. It's just really to show the different varieties of treatment options that we have for these broadleaf or forb species. I do want to highlight that you start to lose some of our tools. Like prescribed fire is less effective against forbs because they don't tend to grow as densely as our annual grasses. And grazing becomes a little more challenging when we have things like toxins, but can still be an option for things like yellow star thistle or perennial pepperweed. And we still have multiple mechanical options and herbicide options. All right, the last section of weed species I'm going to talk about today are the weedy, woody species. So I've got here brooms, which can include Spanish broom, Scotch broom, and French broom in California. That's that top photo with the bright yellow flowers. A lot of folks think it's beautiful, but it can spread like crazy and really dominate an area, excluding everything else. Tree of Heaven is the next photo. It's probably something you've seen a lot. You can see this in riparian areas and along roadsides. It can grow to a 70-foot tall tree, and it has extensive underground root systems that sprout up and can come back after repeated treatments. Now, the last photo I have here is of Himalaya blackberry, which is a viney species that can really be an issue in riparian areas. In most of California grasslands, it's a little too dry for the blackberry to do very well. If you go farther north, you might start to have more blackberry issues because of more rainfall, but typically you'll see these in almost any riparian area. And lastly, I did include fig trees as a weed that you can encounter. Like blackberry, they're more commonly an issue in wet areas around riparian systems, and they can be very dominant and completely exclude any other species in the area. So as with the grasses and forbs, there's some general principles of controlling woody species. The features of woody species is that they're typically highly visible. If you think about a tree versus a grass, one of those is much easier to see if you're driving by a property at 20 miles an hour, and that would be the tree. And so sometimes it can be easier to detect an invasion problem of these woody species. Another benefit of the woody species, or something to keep in mind, is that they will grow slower as a population than something like our grasses or our forbs. For instance, a patch of cheatgrass could expand by thousands of plants every year, but a tree of heaven stand probably would only expand by a couple dozen individuals a year. And so you've got this slower pace of spread. That means that if you have a successful treatment strategy, that will also prolong how long the treatment was effective. How long it was effective for. But of course, there are challenges with these woody species as well. Number one being extensive root systems, like with Tree of Heaven, it's very good at coming back. The Himalaya blackberry is similar. It can spread very quickly from one point, and you will need to remove all of those different root points to be really successful sometimes. The large size can start to get in the way of certain strategies. So trees don't tend to be grazable. The viney species like blackberry can be grazed, but that large size might mean you have to look at larger equipment or different kinds of herbicides. And lastly, the protective bark that is on most of these species can really inhibit the ability to get to the core and kill the plant. So here's again, a very large table on the species that I've talked about, the brooms, the blackberry, the tree of heaven, and the fig. Again, just trying to highlight the different strategies that we have. And again, fire and grazing become less of an option when you've got these larger, more woody species, but mechanical options and herbicide options are still available. So I do want to wrap up with, as I mentioned, some resources. I'm really going to hit hard on this Weed Control Natural Areas book. I think it's a really, really helpful go-to resource. You can buy it online, or you can go to a cooperative extension office to buy it. Then, of course, there's a Weed Research and Information Center, which has been mentioned a couple times this morning. As I mentioned, they have an ID tool that you can go through. Now, WeedCut is a really exciting new tool that's available that focuses specifically on non-chemical options for control. And you can input your site size that you're trying to treat or any limitations like road access, and it can help you really decide what strategy is available to you. And this is especially useful if, let's say, you're working in an area where herbicide use is restricted right now. It goes through all of the different non-chemical options. And lastly, the California Invasive Plant Council also has a ton of resources on their website. So with that, I will thank you all, and I'm happy to deal with any questions. And Whitney, we can do the poll now if you'd like.
Okay, we'll go ahead and launch the poll. I don't see any questions in the chat, but if anyone has any, go ahead and put them in the chat or ask Rebecca. And we'll launch the first poll question here.